All right, U.S. history students, we are going to take a look at life in the British colonies, how the three different colonial regions compared to one another in terms of political, social, and economic structure. So just a note for you before you get started with these notes. Anything when I talk about political characteristics, I'm almost always talking about laws that are made, the way governments make laws, court cases that occur, though anything having to do with the legislative or legal system is almost always going to be a political characteristic. Economic characteristics are going to deal with how people and regions make their money. And social characteristics are going to deal with how society is structured. So upper classes versus lower classes, social hierarchy and how people move between those hierarchies, and of course, cultural achievements that might occur. So the southern New England and middle colonies were very different from each other, yet they share some common traits in their political, economic, and social characteristics. So each of the regions, the southern, middle, and New England, were founded for different reasons. They had different types of interactions with Native Americans, but there are some common characteristics among them. So beginning with political characteristics, so all British colonies were governed with a policy called salutary neglect. Now, I want you to highlight this in your notes because salutary neglect is something that's going to be very, very important for you to understand how the relationship between the colonists and the mother country, England, evolved. So essentially, salutary neglect is the process of the mother country, or England, ignoring the colonies. So during this period, Britain is busy with a whole lot of drama in Europe and a whole lot of internal drama. And so they just don't have the time or the inclination to pay attention to what's going on in the colonies. And so they ignore, and a synonym for ignore is neglect. So they ignore or neglect what's going on in the colonies. And so under salutary neglect, even though British Parliament and the English king controlled the colonies, they just didn't enforce the policies in the colonies. And basically their philosophy was, I don't have time or energy to pay attention to the colonies. And as long as I'm getting what I want from the colonies, I don't really care what they do. And almost all of the colonies had a royal governor who was responsible to the king, but their salaries are paid by the colonists, so you tend to be loyal to the people who pay your salaries, who pay your bills. And so even though the royal governor was technically required to report to the king, he almost always turned a blind eye to things going on in the colonies. And so during the period of salutary neglect, we see the colonies develop pretty sophisticated legal systems. They're able to make their own laws, decide how their economies are going to run. They are basically learning to become independent because the colonies are being neglected by the king and parliament. And so this loose control, this neglect, allows the colonists to create their own colonial assemblies. And a colonial assembly is basically a legislative body, a group of people who make laws for the region. They were democratic self-governments made up of colonists who passed their own laws and taxes. So again, under salutary neglect, colonists are getting used to the idea of being independent. One characteristic that was common among colonial assemblies is that they were almost always controlled by wealthy landowners. If you were to do a survey of our current legislators in the state house, or if you went to Congress, you would probably find that this is still somewhat the case. Maybe not wealthy landowners in the sense of owning large plantations or massive farms, but certainly wealthy people are still controlling large parts of the government. So 2 examples of colonial government. You need to know both of these. The first is the Virginia House of Burgesses, and I list this one first because chronologically it comes first. followed by Massachusetts town meetings. The Virginia House of Burgesses is going to be filled primarily with the wealthy landowners, the landed aristocracy, and town meetings are going to be much more socially open. As long as you were a member of the church, you could, and you were male, you could participate in the town meetings in Massachusetts. So the American colonies were an important part of the transatlantic trade network. So the colonies are founded for the purpose of enriching or making England wealthy. England really has no other interest in the colonies other than to make as much money as it can off of the American colonies. And so the American colonies become a part of the transatlantic trade network. This is also known as the triangular trade. And if you look closely at the map, you can see that there is a sort of triangular shape among the trade. So essentially what we had is raw materials going from England, England making those into manufactured goods, manufactured goods being traded to Africa for slaves, and slaves being transported to the West Indies and then on to the colonies to be sold. So the colonies produced profitable raw materials such as tobacco, wheat, fish, indigo, and whale oil. And then Britain sold manufactured goods back to the colonists like clothing, tea, guns, and tableware. So it would the equivalent of that is I have the lumber. I'm going to sell it back to the mother country. They're going to turn that lumber into furniture, which they then sell back to me. If you think this sounds fishy, you're probably onto something. As population grows, as international trade grows, there's an increased demand for colonial raw materials, and as a result, there is an increased demand for African slaves. And this network created a series of triangular trades among America, Europe, and Africa. By the 1650s, Britain began to embrace the economic policy of mercantilism based on the idea that the colonies exist to generate wealth for the country. So like I said before, the only reason that England invested money to develop colonies is because they believed that they would make a lot of money from the colonies, and they actually do. And this economic policy in which I make money from my colonies is known as mercantilism. Mercantilism is based on the idea of a balance of trade in which a nation exports more than it imports. I want you to highlight that last little bit, a balance of trade in which a nation exports more than it imports. So remember, an export is when you sell goods outside of your country, and an import is when you buy. So mercantilism allows for the mother country to sell more than it buys, therefore making money. So mercantilism meant that Britain wanted to control what was happening in the colonies. If I'm going to make money from the colonies, I need to make sure the colonies are following all of the rules. And so they pass what are called the Navigation Acts to regulate colonial trade. In 1660, Britain began the first series of Navigation Acts designed to restrict colonial trade and increase British wealth, which is a key characteristic of mercantilism, because again, mercantilism is all about making the mother country wealthy. The Navigation Acts required the colonists to trade only with Britain. And if you look at these laws on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that the laws were pretty limiting. You can't trade with the colonies unless you use English ships. Crews of boats had to be at least 3/4 English or colonial. So there's all these stipulations that Britain is putting on the colonies in order to make sure that they make the most money possible. All 13 of the British colonies participated in the transatlantic trade in some capacity, and this chart shows you essentially what their role was. One of the advantages really for this transatlantic trade was the shipbuilding in New England, because with that transatlantic trade, as they start to ship more goods, they need more ships. And so that's kind of a benefit. But ultimately, mercantilism is really limiting for the colonies. So as these colonies start to develop their trade under mercantilism, you start to see some regional differences. You see some similarities in the types of products and trade that go on between the New England and the Middle colonies. And you start to see the Southern colonies really leaning very heavily on agriculture and plantation agriculture. And so this graphic kind of shows you that we have more industrialization. Oh, look, my friend is feeling much better. That's awesome. And industrialization in the north and agriculture in the south. Southern economies were dominated by cash crop agriculture, plantations rather than cities, and huge gaps between the rich and the poor, and slaves and indentured servants. So you have this small wealthy class in the South and a large lower class that is populated primarily by indentured servants and slaves. English colonies typically made up the plantation owners in the nutrient-rich lands in the east. You're going to see more German and Scotch-Irish leading up to this boundary here where the Appalachian Mountains typically run. And then the former English indentured servants, Irish and German, again moved to the backcountry, which is here, which was characterized typically by less valuable soil near Native Americans, and the people who lived out in the backcountry typically lived in fairly abject poverty. Slavery was much more common in the South than it was in the northern colonies, as you can see in this graphic. And 80 to 90% of Southern slaves were field workers, most on plantations. So the white population in New York was 86%, 14% Black, 98% white in Massachusetts, 2% Black in Massachusetts. And then you see in South Carolina, the number of Blacks living in South Carolina actually outnumbered the number of whites. So this should show you, and your takeaway from this should be that there was a much larger percentage of Blacks living in the South and in the North and living in the institution of slavery. Slave importation to the Americas increases drastically once mercantilism goes into full effect, and then even on into the early years of the American Republic. Slaves come from a variety of places in West Africa and had a variety of language and cultures, as you can see here on the map, from all the way from places like Sierra Leone down into Angola and some southeastern parts of Africa. Slaves used music and dance to maintain their African culture as much as possible. And slave families were common, but marriages between slaves were not legally recognized in the colonies. And of course, marriages were not recognized until the abolition of slavery. Slave religion often blended African rituals with Christianity. And slaves living in horrible conditions, developed methods of resistance, including running away, slowing down work, or sabotaging equipment. In the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, you actually have a full-fledged rebellion. 150 slaves attacked and killed over 20 whites. The effect of the Stono Rebellion, though, is going to be the introduction of very, very harsh slave codes, or essentially laws that formalize slavery and punish slaves very harshly for even the most minor offenses. The northern economy is going to develop much more diversely than the South. The South is going to become a one-trick pony that does agriculture and only agriculture. And then eventually, of course, they're going to lean heavily on just a handful of crops. Where the northern farms were smaller, but they were much more diverse in terms of what they grow. So in addition to farming, the northern economy also included lumber, shipbuilding, fishing, and ironwork. So from very, very early on, you see the American colonies where the New England and the Mid-Atlantic colonies start to develop very diverse economies, and the Southern economy tends to be just agriculture. We also see cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York become very important ports for international trade. And the northern cities, these large cities, gave people more professional and trade opportunity than anywhere in the colonies. So again, from very, very early on, places like Philadelphia and Boston, New York are becoming hotbeds of industry and commerce, and giving people lots of opportunities to engage in lots of different types of professions. So to say that slavery only existed in the South is not true. During the colonial period, slavery existed in the northern colonies. So they exist in New England, they exist in the Mid-Atlantic colonies. Slaves in New England and the Mid-Atlantic colonies worked primarily on small-scale farms or as domestic servants. But the percentage of slaves living in those areas was much, much less, as you can see in this graphic here. So, like in the South, English, German, and Irish immigrants in the New England and Mid-Atlantic colonies lived in the back country as small-scale farmers. So by the 1700s, church attendance across each of the colonial regions had declined. And we see the development of a very, very important movement called the Great Awakening. So in the 1730s and 1740s, the Great Awakening began as preachers used revivals to encourage religious conversions. So in the New England colonies, which were founded for religious purposes, you see a very strict Puritan religion in which there are lots of rules and the idea of predestination. Well, the Great Awakening changes that with that there's salvation through a relationship with God. And the Great Awakening is going to lead people to question the things that they had been taught in church. It's going to encourage more people to go to church, and it's also going to encourage people to question authority. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield were very popular evangelists. They used fire and passion and camp revivals to encourage people to examine and reinvest in their faith. The Great Awakening leads to new denominations developing in the colonies, including Methodists and Baptists. And the Great Awakening took place in all 13 colonies and becomes the first national American event. So the important takeaway from the Great Awakening really is two things. One, it is the first national event. So whether I lived in Massachusetts or if I lived in Georgia, I had experienced the Great Awakening. It creates a sort of sense of unity among the colonies for this having had this common experience. The other important effect of the Great Awakening is it leads people to question the teachings that they had learned their whole lives, and it leads them to question authority for the first time. So as they start to think about questioning authority, this becomes one of the first steps towards the American Revolution in terms of revolutionary ideas.